So all of the discussion boards are on fire right now. Great work to all of you. There's some just really great ideas going around and very on point with what is going on in our readings. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of things in the Philip and Lorde readings as we move into the poetry collection Zong, just for us to think about, kind of help focus a little bit. So for those who are interested, I posted the video below of Philip reading this, and so you can get the order that she reads it in. You can also hear her voice and where she puts emphasis on certain words, the speed at which she reads. All of those things can really change our understanding of readings, especially when the author themselves is the one reading it to us. The other thing is just hearing her voice as you go into Zong, and those poems can also be helpful. So the big thing here, and I mean there was a lot of this discussion about mother tongue versus father tongue, and connecting to like the ideas of motherland versus fatherland versus homeland, and lots of, it's all sort of grounded in post-colonial theory, and those terms shift and change depending on who's using them and how they're using them. I know it'd be easier if everyone just agreed that they meant the same thing, because sometimes like the motherland can align with the father tongue, but then some people align the mother tongue with the motherland, and it's all very confusing. Anyways, but getting to it, the big thing here with language is that language is culture, and so linguists and those in like cultural studies will say that the survival of a culture is dependent on the survival of that language. And in terms of seeing, right, there's certain things, certain languages, depending on where that culture is and people live, the things they do, what's important values, right, there's lots of words to reflect that. And then you move over into like another language from another culture that doesn't share those things, then you try to translate and you can't, right? So translation isn't as easy as it seems, right? So that's one thing. And so when you can't communicate and you can't say the thing, pieces of the culture start dying. And the other thing is that the culture is maintained and passed by mothers. That's a really sort of big thing, even in like American society, even in English speaking cultures, things like that. It's sort of this ongoing thing that mothers as nurturers and child rearing and all of that stuff pass on in culture. Not to say that fathers can't. It's just this sort of like generalization that took over and exists. So these are like some of the things that are coming up in this and thinking about language. And so moving into the Lorde, right, well, I'll come back to this one. We'll start with the master's tools just briefly. Going down to like the quote here, where is that? I lost it. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about the genuine change, and this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. So this idea of the master's tools. So if we think about language as a tool, and in Philip's case, right, like the idea of using language, like the oppressor's language, English, right? How can you really like get at the issues, get at the problems, address them, undo them, right? Using that language. And so in this case, right, like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. you can't use English to like undo the damage that's been done by English, right? Or like the cultures that like came in. Again, this is the colonization, post-colonial theory stuff coming in here. And so in thinking about the master's tools as language is really important for the work that Phillips does. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Okay, going back up to the transformation in silence. So there's a lot of here thinking about like what silence does, what it means that Lorde is talking about, why it exists, right? Fear leading to silence, amongst other things. And the importance of this is Phillips' project with Zong is she is trying to recover a silence that happened. So the Zong is a slave ship. There was one manifest and the 2-page court ruling document, and that is all she could find that existed about the ship and what happened on board the ship. There's like I've read there's like history books like titled Zong and all of this stuff. So, I checked them out, opened them up, and they're like 200 pages of questions with no answers because there's no information. So for her, this is like huge void, this huge silence, and trying to find it and fill it, in order to understand what happened at that moment in history that in a lot of ways has been lost. So she's trying to recover it by breaking the silence. So in terms of what Lorde is talking about connected to silence and this idea of survival, right? So because in this way alone we can survive by taking part in the process of life that is creative and continuing, that is growth, right? So using this creative outlet in order to address these like atrocities that have impacted history, and particularly the history of those of African descent in the Americas via the slave trade, right? And then finally, Lorde's poetry is not a luxury. Again, getting at what it is that poetry achieves. And I mean, there's a lot of times that poetry and creative writing in general is talked about as, oh, it's just like, it's fun, or it can like make people feel better. It can, be like therapy and so on and so forth. And part of it is there's a lot more to it than that. And thinking about who gets to write poetry, whose poetry is well received, and in terms of like who gets to write poetry, whose poetry is accepted, who can live off of their poetry and being a writer. And for a lot of times that was men, not women, right? And that's what Lorde was getting at in this essay, and thinking about whose thoughts and ideas and stuff are valued. There's also a current belief, like today, 2020, that literature written by men is universal, which means everyone can relate to it and understand it, while literature written by women is for women, right? It's not universal. Like we can't read it and relate and connect to it and understand the experience as a universal experience. So there's a belief that like women are not capable of writing universal experiences. Likewise, it is the same for writers of color. So it's believed that like white men, again, can write like universal experience, but both men and women of color cannot, right? It's always going to be something that's like more niche, and everyone can't possibly understand or attempt to connect with or relate to. And so part of that is also reflected in this idea of who gets to write and the importance of these projects for the people doing them. And so I think that's what is also coming through in Phillips' Zong is she's again, trying to give voice to so much and so many who were silenced in their deaths, right? And respect what happened to them, and using poetry for a much larger purpose and trying to like reconcile something that really can't be reconciled. So that's just like trying to draw some connections and think about what's happening here with language and why it matters for us and the direction that we're going.